Hitler's forgotten persecution. Hitler's persecution of the Roma people in Nazi Germany. 1936. Berlin, Marzahn district. The German summer sun, which would soon illuminate the grandeur of the Olympic Games, beat down on the new barbed wire fences. Here, in an open field on the outskirts of the capital, the fence was not there to stop enemies of the state. It was there to stop families. Sinti and Roma Gypsies, forced to camp in precarious conditions, were the stain the Reich was trying to hide from the Olympic showcase. The camp, known as Zigeunerlager Marzahn, was a center of forced internment, a pre-genocide. In Munich or Nuremberg, Nazi ideologues looked away. For the NSDP leadership, the Gypsy people, Roma and Sinti, were a secondary issue, a social and criminal anomaly requiring only overt policing. They were not the existential Jewish threat. They were merely vagrants to be contained. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, the supreme architect of terror, was focused on the purity of the Aryan race. Ironically, he harbored a perverse fascination with a small minority of Romani, whom he considered racially pure, original descendants of Aryans who had migrated from India. Himmler's speech, false, intellectualized voice, excerpt from speech, 1937. We must isolate and preserve these pure elements as historical proof of our own Aryan origin. As for the remainder, the vast majority of mixed bloods, Mischlinge, they are a racially and socially degenerate mixture, which must be treated like other asocials. It is a matter of state hygiene, not high politics. Himmler ignored the depth of historical persecution and underestimated the lethality which his own pseudoscience would soon unleash upon them. The policy, which began as a cynical marginalization of fighting crime, would be redirected toward a methodical racial extermination.
Racial Hygiene and Department L3. The project of systematic persecution of the Gypsy people was born from a sinister marriage between ideological fanaticism and perverted science. In 1936, the Nazi regime formally established the Research Unit for Racial Hygiene and Population Biology, Rassenhygienische und Bevölkerungsbiologische Forschungsstelle, headed by Dr. Robert Ritter and his assistant, Eva Justin. This unit was given the mission to study the Zigeunerfrage, the Gypsy question, and provide the scientific basis for the Reich's Gypsy law. The Ritter Project faced the technical difficulty of reconciling the ideological myth with reality. Ideological failure. How to justify the extermination of a people who, theoretically, had Aryan roots. Ritter's cynical solution was to label the majority, about 90%, as mixed bloods, or Mischlinge. The purity of their origin had been corrupted, making them racial aliens, and therefore targets. Technical report, Dr. Robert Ritter, 1937. The bulk of Romani individuals in German territory must be considered genetically inferior and a source of racial infection and endemic criminality. The future treatment of the question must be of a prophylactic nature, compulsory sterilization and permanent confinement. The criterion is no longer legal but biological. The transformation of perception and legal consolidation. In 1938, Himmler's decree on the Gypsy question made the registration of all Roma, Sinti, and mixed bloods over the age of 6 mandatory. The decisive step came with the official inclusion of Gypsies in the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans. The persecution, previously based on old anti-Zionist superstitions, was now codified as state policy based on race. The fate of the Gypsy people in Nazi Germany was sealed. From then on, the path was open for the Gypsy final solution, a genocide that the Roma and Sinti people would call Porajmos, the Devouring.
2. From Marzahn to Auschwitz. The escalation of genocide. The radicalization of policy. With the start of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the persecution of the Roma and Sinti peoples ceased to be bureaucratic confinement and became active extermination. Eastern Europe, with its vast territories and the absence of international supervision, was transformed into Nazism's great laboratory of death. The Roma, like the Jews, were an immediate target of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads of the SS. Their mission was to cleanse the newly conquered territories of all racial and ideological enemies. Mass executions and the Wehrmacht. In the fields and villages of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, Einsatzgruppen units and, crucially, regular Wehrmacht units murdered thousands of Roma in mass executions. Testimony, survivor's voice, shocked tone. They took entire families to the forests. There was no separation. It was the bullet. The mass graves for the Gypsies were as common as those for the Jews. There were no camps, only the pit. Roma were frequently accused of being spies or partisans, a cynical pretext for racial mass murder. What began with Dr. Ritter's pseudo-scientific registration ended with a bullet to the back of the neck, executed by men convinced they were performing a service of racial security. Biological control. Parallel to extermination by firing squad, Nazi eugenic policy aimed to prevent the reproduction of individuals considered genetically defective or racially dangerous. Compulsory sterilization legislation was aggressively applied to the Roma and Sinti peoples, mainly to the Mishingli, defined by the Ritter Institute. Medicine, once again, acted as an accomplice to genocide. Thousands of Roma were subjected to forced surgical procedures in hospitals and later in the concentration camps themselves. The goal was genetic elimination, ensuring that the Gypsy plague could not infect the future of the Reich. Himmler's decision. In December 1942, Heinrich Himmler signed the decree that would seal the fate of the Romani population still living in the Greater German Reich. The order was clear: immediate deportation of all Roma and Sinti to a centralized concentration camp. The chosen destination was none other than the heart of the extermination complex, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Zigeunerlager, Sector BIIE. In 1943, the Zigeunerlager, Gypsy family camp, was established within Sector BIIE of Birkenau. This unit was unique and a perverse symbol of Nazi propaganda. 1. Families together. Unlike Jews and most political prisoners, Roma and Sinti families, including children, were kept together in the barracks. This was a propaganda tactic to show Red Cross inspectors, if necessary, that Gypsy families were being housed. 2. The Z tattoo. Upon arrival, Roma and Sinti prisoners were tattooed, but with a technical difference. The identification number was preceded by the letter Z, Zigeuner. Conditions and the wait for death. About 23,000 Roma and Sinti were incarcerated in the Zigeunerlager. Overcrowding and hygiene conditions were deliberately catastrophic. Diseases like typhus and scarlet fever spread uncontrollably. The mortality rate was higher than in other parts of the camp. The Zigeunerlager became the workplace and research site of the infamous Dr. Josef Mengele. Fascinated by genetic anomalies, Mengele performed inhumane experiments on Roma children and prisoners, especially those suffering from heterochromia iridis, differently colored eyes, who were murdered so that their organs could be collected and sent to research institutes in the Reich. Himmler's policy from 1937 had reached its logical conclusion. Racial study culminated in the scientific and systematic murder of its victims. The Porajmos had industrialized at Auschwitz.
3. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Night of Destruction. Living conditions and fading hope. In Sector BIIE of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Zigeunerlager survived from 1943 to 1944. The policy of keeping families together, however cruel the context, created an internal cohesion. This cohesion, however, did not protect against hunger, typhus, and Mengele's medical sadism. About 21,000 of the 23,000 Roma and Sinti sent to Auschwitz died there, most from disease and starvation. In May 1944, the SS attempted the first liquidation of the camp. The orders were to evacuate the Roma to the gas chambers. But the prisoners, warned by rumors and by prisoners from other blocks, armed themselves with knives, shovels, and iron bars. The fact of resistance, when confronted by the SS for evacuation, the Roma and Sinti prisoners refused to leave the barracks. The SS, unwilling to risk a direct confrontation that could disrupt the extermination complex at the peak of the Hungarian transports, temporarily retreated. It was an act of desperate resistance based on the strength of the family community. The Night of Liquidation, August 2, 1944. The technical end. The SS would not tolerate disobedience. After months of preparation and the deportation of able-bodied Roma to other camps for work, what remained in BIIE were the most vulnerable, mainly women, children, and the elderly. August 2, 1944. The night fell dark and cold over Birkenau. Testimony: Piero Terracina, Jewish survivor. I was imprisoned in another block, but it was night and there was a curfew. In the middle of the night, we heard screams in German, barking dogs. They surrounded the Zigeunerlager. Screams, crying, a few shots. After more than 2 hours, there was only silence. In the morning, the windows of the Zigeunerlager were closed. The camp was empty. In a single operation, the SS liquidated the Zigeunerlager. More than 4,000 people, the rest of the Roma and Sinti population, were dragged to the crematoria and murdered in the gas chambers. This date, August 2nd, marks the industrial completion of the Porajmos at Auschwitz. It was the apex of the genocide, the methodical annihilation of a racially defined population.
The statistic of genocide, the Porajmos, the Devouring, or the mass murder, was a parallel in lesser recognized genocide to the Jewish Holocaust. Total victims, historical estimates vary from 220,000 to 500,000 Roma and Sinti murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. The number represents between 25% to 50% of the total Romani population in Europe before the war. The tragedy was not only quantitative, but a total destruction of culture and family history. Post-war non-recognition. The horror of the Porajmos was obscured for decades after 1945, a phenomenon known as the Second Persecution. 1. Legal difficulty. Unlike the Jews, whose crimes were clearly defined after Nuremberg, many post-war governments in Germany and Eastern Europe continued to view the Roma and Sinti not as victims of genocide, but as asocials and habitual criminals, the same rhetoric used by the Nazis. 2. Reparations denied. For many years, Roma and Sinti victims were denied the right to war reparations.
Dr. Robert Ritter's pseudo-scientific examinations, which classified the majority as criminal Mischlinge, were used by German bureaucrats to deny compensation, under the claim that the persecution had been motivated by crime, not by race. 3. Late technical recognition. It was not until 1982 that West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl formally recognized that the Roma and Sinti people had been persecuted and murdered for racial reasons, a genocide. The struggle for memory. The history of the Porajmos is the story of a millennia-old prejudice that found its technological and industrial peak in the hands of Nazism. It was the most brutal materialization of Dr. Ritter's report. Today, August 2 is the International Day of Commemoration of the Holocaust for the Sinti and Roma. The Devouring, the Porajmos, remains a brutal chapter that demands to be remembered not only for its numbers, but for the persistent struggle against the racism that allowed it to be forgotten. The legacy of Hitler's persecution against the Roma people is not just the smoke of Auschwitz, but the official silence that followed. They were victims of a total hatred, and their memory is the last and most urgent battlefield against oblivion.